Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Karen Tucker, and I am the Churchill Club CEO. Thank you very much for coming out and being with us this morning. This morning, our speakers are going to address the question, what is the role of natural gas in a decarbonizing energy future? Gas and hydrocarbons represent 90% of the world's energy, and this has to change, but how will it play out? How will gas affect different sectors? How will it interact with other energy sources? And our speakers will address these questions and more. And you may not know if you're a first-time Churchill visitor, but it is definitely incumbent on our audience members to raise your hand and ask questions during audience Q&A if there is something that you would like to have be addressed that wasn't already addressed from the stage. So here on the stage, we have a very distinguished group of individuals. Starting here with Mark Zoback, our moderator, Natural Gas Initiative, Stanford University. Next to him, Sally Benson, Precourt Energy Institute, Stanford. Adam Brandt, Department of Energy Resources Engineering, Stanford. And then Maarten Wetselaar from Royal Dutch Shell. Welcome. Thank you very much. We especially wish to acknowledge a few people without whose help this would not have been possible. Tom Baird, Catherine Thomason, and Kirsten Smart at Shell, and Mark and Brad Ritz at the Stanford NGI for their partnership in enabling the program. And also, we extend our gratitude to Ken King and Skadden for opening their doors this morning to this beautiful conference center here in Palo Alto. And after the program and the videotaping is done, we will raise the shade so that you can see the tremendous view in the tallest building between San Francisco and San Jose. A special hello to our first-time visitors. If you're not familiar with Churchill Club, we are a convener of conversations to explore new opportunities around innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. This includes topics like leadership and collaboration. We do up to 30 programs a year. We're an independent nonprofit, and we have been doing these programs since 1985. If you'd like to learn more, it's churchillclub.org. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and other Twitter handles appear in your bulletins. If you need to get the Wi-Fi code that's available at the registration desk. Anyway, it's a little bit too complicated for me to say. Have you get it? So now let's give our warmest welcome to our speakers.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Zoback. We're each going to introduce ourselves very briefly in just a minute. And it's a pleasure on behalf of the Natural Gas Initiative at Stanford and the Churchill Club to welcome all of you. The context for this discussion has been, a revolution in the oil and gas industry that really didn't engage Silicon Valley, but will affect Silicon Valley. And that is, it's now clear that on a global basis, we have essentially an unlimited supply of natural gas that can play a key role in the decarbonization of the global energy system. But how is that going to be accomplished? How do we optimize the use of natural gas? How do we minimize the environmental impacts of both the extraction of natural gas, the distribution, and the use? And how do we, address some of the outstanding fundamental questions that would expand its use beyond the use to which it's put today? And I hope my colleagues and I can provide a little useful information on that topic, and then we'll be available to answer your questions in the second half of the program. So before we really get going, let me just take a second. You have short bios on all of us. I'm a professor of geophysics at Stanford University for about the last 30 years, and for the last 2 years I've been engaged with the Natural Gas Initiative. It's one of my 3 current jobs on campus, but it's one I enjoy a great deal. Sally?
Okay, so I am Sally Benson. I am a professor here at Stanford University in the Energy Resources Engineering Department. I'm also the director of our Precourt Institute for Energy, which is a campus-wide organization that pulls together all the variety of activities and launches a number of new initiatives and so forth. Just a little bit more about me. I'm what's called a hydrogeologist. That means I understand how fluids move through rocks. And I've spent a long time working on environmental issues and energy issues, and now focused on decarbonization of the global energy system.
Hi, Adam Brandt, Assistant Professor in the Department of Energy Resources Engineering as well at Stanford. I work mostly on areas related to climate impacts of use of fossil fuels. In particular, for relevance to this program today, I've been doing a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years on leakage from the natural gas system and ways to solve that problem and the climate impacts therein.
Good morning. My name is Maarten Wetselaar. I work for Royal Dutch Shell, better known sometimes as just Shell, where I'm on the executive committee and I'm the director for our integrated gas business, the global business that produces and transports natural gas from where it's found to where it's used. Alongside that, I am responsible for our new energies business, which is all about fuels like hydrogen, biofuels, renewable source of power, and new ways of getting energy to customers. If I just want to perhaps double the challenge level in the room, we talked a bit about decarbonizing the world energy system, and that is definitely needed if we're going to follow through on the COP21 promises that were made in Paris last year. But a few months earlier, the United Nations also reaffirmed its development goals that include ending not only just poverty around the world, but very much part of that, and ending poverty, ending energy poverty. And if we're going to pursue that, we're going to need to double the size of the energy system in the course of this century, whilst decarbonizing it at the same time. So as we talk about this challenge, it is really a challenge of providing twice as much energy, and then at the end of the day, without any CO2 impact left. And the role natural gas can play in that transition and in that end game obviously fascinates me professionally, but also very much personally.
Thank you. As I mentioned to Maarten earlier, when I talk about natural gas with students who are sort of disinclined to think about traditional fossil fuels, and natural gas has been around for a long time, I usually say two things. One is, try to open your mind and think about a fossil fuel as being part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And second, to actually consider the scale of this challenge that Maarten just was talking about, of decarbonizing, maintaining economic growth and energy security and all the other things that environmental protection, all the other things people care about, and at the same time doubling the scale of the energy system. And if the students weren't sort of intimidated by the scale of that challenge, they really weren't paying attention. And it's just a huge societal challenge that we'll all have to face together over the remainder of this century. Before I go any further, Stanford's not a traditional oil school, and I think it may have struck some people by surprise that we've undertaken this campus-wide initiative in natural gas. So maybe my first question will be to Sally, who looks at energy in a very broad way, and let her talk a little bit about what's going on at Stanford about energy in general and how natural gas sort of fits into that program.
Okay. All right. Terrific. So I want to go back to something that Maarten just said, and I really like your framing that the world is going to need twice as much energy by the end of the century, and I agree with you. And one of the things that I think is hidden in that number is that if we were to achieve a global energy system that's twice what it is today, the energy intensity per person would be about a third of what it is in the United States. So even though 2 times seems like a really big number, what it would actually mean for a place like the United States is we've got to get dramatically more efficient if we're going to sort of converge on a global average energy use. So that's a tough target. So that's a grand challenge. There are billions of people lacking access to modern energy. And that comes with terrible environmental and health consequences for those individuals. At the very same time, you also mentioned decarbonization. And the best way to think about that is that by 2100, we need to have zero emissions of CO2 and methane and everything else. As a matter of fact, there are many studies which say not only do we need zero, but we probably need negative emissions. In other words, we have to be actively extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequestering it in some place. So those are two really enormous challenges. So that brings us to the Precourt Institute for Energy. So there are about 200 faculty working on energy-related issues at Stanford, and thousands of students. I don't think that there's any topic more important and more exciting, and literally the best people across the entire university are working on this. So why natural gas? We also do a lot of work in renewables, batteries, you name it, nuclear, but why natural gas? So natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel. I think it's as simple as that. If you look at carbon dioxide emissions, it's got about half the carbon dioxide emissions compared to coal per unit of energy in that. So that's a good thing. It also doesn't have so many particulates and so forth. So to bring that home, what that really means, if you look at the U.S. energy system, we're actually in the middle of a pretty radical transformation of how we produce and deliver electricity. And if we roll the clock back to 10 years ago, that about 50% of the or fuel for electricity came from coal. And I think nobody thought that it was going to be possible to really make a significant dent in that. We have lots of cheap coal, an amazing supply chain to deliver that to power plants and so forth. But what happened is this shale gas revolution that Mark talked about, which provided very inexpensive natural gas. And purely on economic grounds, because it was cheaper to produce electricity with natural gas than with coal, what we've seen is a shift, and now only 33% of our electricity comes from coal, and I think we can anticipate seeing that changing. I don't know that it's going to go to zero anytime soon, but it's certainly so the environmental consequences of that shift are that the U.S. surprisingly has reduced its CO2 emissions 10% compared to the peak that we had in 2007. So that's quite extraordinary. Nobody would have thought that would have happened. One could argue, well, we have lots of renewables. Yes, we do, but if you really look at the single biggest factor in those reductions, it has to do with natural gas. So from my point of view, from decarbonization, natural gas is a very pragmatic approach. So what did we want to do at Stanford? Why this big focus? We created this initiative. Mark agreed to be the leader. So number one, we can do a lot better to produce the gas that's underground. We're only able to produce about 25% of what's in a formation, so we can do better than that. We would like to think of new uses of natural gas. How can we convert it to useful liquids, for example, so that it can play a larger role in the transportation system? There are environmental issues and regulatory issues associated with the natural gas, and you'll hear more about that. So we can work on that. There are very important geopolitical issues, particularly if you look over in Russia and the Baltic states, with manipulation of the political system based on either gaining access or holding back access to natural gas. That needs to be addressed. So we looked at all of these areas and said we have a lot to offer, and we created this initiative. So it's good for the environment, good for the economy, and an important part of the pathway to deep decarbonization.
Thank you. We hope you take a lot away from this discussion this morning. But let me tell you about a couple things that are happening in the next year that you're able to participate in if you should be so motivated. And they are very consistent with the themes that Sally just mentioned and some of the things you'll hear about today. One is a symposium that is going to be on gas-to-liquid technology to very much expand the use of natural gas. Another is on a workshop that we're going to hold on the integration of natural gas into clean energy strategies, how to use natural gas and renewables together to move decarbonization forward in many different countries. And we're going to turn our conversation to that topic in just a second. But we will be holding a meeting on that, and you're welcome to attend. A third is the use of natural gas for addressing energy poverty. Well over 1 billion people have no access to energy as we know it in any form, are basically picking up sticks and using them for heating, cooking, and whatever their needs are. And natural gas can play a role in that as well. And finally is an effort to somehow capture in sort of an objective way an overview of the opportunities and benefits and do a comprehensive risk analysis on natural gas from extraction to end use. If you're interested in any of those 4 topics, please contact us and we'll provide the details. So one topic of particular interest to a number of us on the panel is the use of natural gas as part of strategies to decarbonize. Many people very simplistically think, well, we know where we are today. We have a fossil fuel dominated energy system. We know where we want to be in the future. We want to decarbonize and use renewables to the extent possible and decarbonize completely, as Sally and Maarten pointed out. But they don't see the fact that that there's a role for natural gas, an important role, a critical role, many of us believe, in working together in an integrated way with renewables to achieve that decarbonization goal. So I'd like to take a few minutes now and let both Maarten and Sally comment on this and how they see moving forward, not from a perspective of Silicon Valley or California or even the United States, but how to move forward globally. Maarten?
Yeah, thanks. And when you talk about decarbonizing the energy system, it's useful to break it down in a number of its component parts, because they all have different decarbonization trajectories. Some are easier than others, and the role of natural gas in all of them is different. So if I break it down to 4, which would be power, transport, industry, and buildings, you will first of all say there's overlap between them because power provides energy to the other 3, but it's still useful to look at the 4. Power generation is probably the one that's most discussed as the one that needs to be decarbonized and that can be decarbonized, because renewables, wind and solar, are the obvious inputs that would decarbonize a power system. Few things to remember there is, first of all, electricity only powers 20% delivers 20% of the total energy demand in the world. So even if we completely decarbonize electricity, which isn't totally trivial, we'll only in the current energy mix have decarbonized 20% of the total energy mix. The rest is really transport and industry. And so one of the things that we need to do is to really push electrification very, very hard of the other sectors, in order to make sure that electricity comes to its full potential in terms of helping to decarbonize the energy system. But as you do that, then clearly that in any trajectory that goes from today to an end state where electricity is mostly or even exclusively powered by renewables, there's a very, very big job for natural gas to play. In the near term, it's all about making sure that coal gets out of the energy mix and gas and renewables take its place. And then over time, as an electricity system that gets used to how it deals with the intermittency of renewables, how it adopts new storage strategies, gas will still be needed in order to provide the kind of stability that we are used to. And it's not only about comfort, but it's also really about keeping our society running from a perspective of the economy, manufacturing, etc. So electricity is an important one to get right. The second one, when it comes to buildings, that's quite an exciting sector of the energy mix. Buildings use a lot of power or a lot of energy, and essentially can be totally electrified. They don't need anything else than electricity, and through the pathway of electricity, they can therefore be totally decarbonized. Then you're left with transport and industry, and they're more tricky. So on transport, you can certainly partly electrify transport, and there's good examples around from California and other parts of the world where we're starting to use electricity to go around. But particularly heavy transport, ships, trucks, buses, it will probably need other sources, and natural gas can play a very, very important role, not only in transition but also in the end mix and making sure transport decarbonizes as much as it can. And the same answer holds true for industry, where a number of light industries can certainly electrify, but a number of the heavier industries, chemicals, steel production, cement, simply don't need the energy intensity of a hydrocarbon. And again, pushing those industries to use gas predominantly or even exclusively rather than the current alternatives can really help us get to a decarbonized world in the end. So across the four, gas has neither a transitory role or a destination role to play in getting those sectors of the energy system to the lowest carbon intensity possible.
Sally?
Okay, yeah. So I'll bring it home to California. And how many of you have the app Cal ISO Today? Okay. The app on your phone? Oh, okay. Anyway, there's one on your phone too. Anyway, that's like my favorite website. It tells like this really amazing story of what's happened in California. That like right now, it's 11 o'clock or something in the morning, we're probably producing about 7 gigawatts of power from utility scale solar. I'm guessing we're probably using around 25 gigawatts of total energy. And basically what happens now, because we have this enormous amount of utility scale solar, which is incredibly exciting, is that starting around 6 o'clock in the morning, the power comes up, pretty much stays flat throughout the middle of the day, and then it drops off. Okay, but it's really providing a lot of power. As a matter of fact, it's more than wind in California. But there's a real challenge in the morning when the sun comes up, and all of a sudden you're generating all this power. We have to rapidly turn off a lot of other generation. We can't have overgeneration on the system. Electricity is really astonishing. You have to, at every moment, have perfectly matched supply and demand. So we have to turn off a lot of generation. And then in the evening, everyone comes home. That's actually our peak demand time. But that's exactly when the sun is going down and the power is just dropping off precipitously. So how do we make this work? Well, in California, what we do is we use natural gas combustion turbines, and actually we're doing even our natural gas combined cycle plants. They're now operating in such a way is that they can be turned on and off to help meet supply and demand and keep that steady flow of electricity while still allowing this enormous amount of solar on the grid. So that's right now. So it's a challenge now. But look forward to 2020. California is committed to 33% renewables by 2020. And we're about 25% right now. And how are we going to do it? Well, the real answer is it's going to be more solar. As a matter of fact, we'll probably triple the solar on the grid. And there will be times when solar is nearly providing all the electricity Californians are using, all Californians. But that's going to create even more dramatic challenges. Sometimes you've probably heard of the duck curve. It's another way of saying it. But basically, without the ability to ramp up and down gas turbines, it would be impossible to accommodate the enormous amount of solar. So contrast us to Germany, for example. They also have a huge amount of solar on their grid. They've really been the leader and the pioneer, and thank goodness for them. But they have coal as their backup to the renewables. And the problem with coal plants is you can't turn them on and off so easily. They like to operate in a base load manner. So whereas Germany is kind of really hitting the solar wall today because they don't have the flexibility we have, California does have the opportunity to continue to expand the renewables and at the same time provide a reliable supply. But anyway, because we're using natural gas.
Good.
Mark, could I chime in a little bit on some of these long-term trends?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I wanted to echo one thing that Maarten had mentioned about electrification. So you study the long-term history of energy, and Sally and I co-teach a class on this. There's lots of trends that sort of come and go. One trend that hasn't come and gone, and in fact has nothing, as far as I can tell, to do with climate or environmental concerns, and in fact precedes them by many, many decades, is a century-long, relentless overtake of electricity in buildings, commercial, and industry. This is one of the few things that has really held over a century, is that every year consistently in the United States, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere, is that electricity provides more and more of the final energy demand in our buildings, in our businesses, and in our industry. And I think that's going to continue regardless, because electricity is such a convenient and useful energy source. And so this really is something that's going to happen, climate policy or not. Increasingly, our technologies are electrified. And so this, I think, is a really nice piece of sort of congruence in these sort of general trends, is this almost unstoppable century-long transition towards electricity. And I think it can only accelerate from here.
Thank you, Adam. You know, one of the big issues, of course, with natural gas is the public perception and the reality of environmental impacts. The fear of fracking is widespread and entrenched in many parts of the country and many parts of the world. And we've had, very serious issues, here in our backyard. 5 years ago, we had a very serious blowout of the natural gas pipeline in San Bruno. A number of people were killed, and the impacts are still being felt, and the importance of understanding methane leakage is more important than ever, not only for public safety, but for environmental consequences. So to just isolate the one issue of methane leakage for a minute, because it may well be the Achilles heel of expanded use of natural gas. We're lucky to have Adam, because it is an area where he is one of the world experts, and I'd like to give him a chance to at least provide you some baseline information on what we currently know about the methane leakage problem and what we're doing to identify leaks and fix them.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So a couple things to note. One important question that I often talk to people about is, why should we be concerned about methane leakage? If you combust all the methane, if you burn it all, it's much cleaner than coal. If you let some of the natural gas leak out of the system unburned, it's emitted mostly as methane. Methane is actually quite a potent greenhouse gas. Over a 100-year time period, it's on a mass-per-mass basis, it's about 30 times more potent than CO2. And so for this reason, relatively small fractions of leakage can have reasonably large impacts on the climate benefits of using using gas in place of coal, for example. Every engineered system is imperfect. We're not able to build perfect machines. So, for example, the electricity system typically loses 5 to 8% of the generated electricity before it makes it to your house. UPS will always lose some packages, right? Nothing is perfect. So how good is the natural gas system? It's actually pretty good. High-pressure gas systems are hard to maintain. Gas likes to leak if it's at high pressure. It wants to get out of the atmosphere 24/7. Every second, the gas wants to leak out. But we have a pretty tight system. The EPA estimates that something like 1.5% of the gas that's produced in the system is lost along the value chain before it's consumed. I think the consensus or the sense of the science is that this is probably low. I think a more realistic estimate, based on a bunch of very recent science over the last couple of years, is that the number is probably closer to 2 or 3%. I'd be surprised if it was over 3%, although some isolated regions there has been higher rates of leakage that have been reported and measured. There's a whole bunch of exciting things happening right now in the world of gas leakage. This has achieved incredible prominence, mostly due to a big effort by the Environmental Defense Fund in collaboration with a bunch of scientists to go around and do a really unprecedented set of studies to try to get at this leakage problem. And really the motivation there, again, as I said, if we're going to be using more and more gas to support renewables, we really need to get this leakage number down so that we don't have the climate impact of methane. And so they've led a really large set of studies over the last 2 or 3 years, and a bunch of new science is coming out almost every week on this issue. So in addition to sort of more science and trying to understand where the leakage is coming from, there's a whole set of policies that are advancing at the same time. So EPA is working in the U.S. federally to, for example, institute new regulations around checking gas systems in a structured way for leaks. And so companies that produce gas will have to go out and survey in a structured way to find leaks. There's a variety of state-level efforts as well. In addition, on the scientific and R&D side, there's a bunch of interest at the federal level. ARPA-E, for example, is sponsoring quite a large grant program to develop new methane detectors. And there's a bunch of other sort of private R&D efforts as well to develop new detectors. I'm hopeful that this is an area where we're going to be making a lot of progress over the next 5 years or so. Many ideas. We can do detection a lot better. We can automate it. We can take human labor costs out of the equation. We can automatically scan for leaks. I think there's a lot of ways that we can basically find these problems and fix them, hopefully, as soon as they arise and really get these numbers down. Globally, this could be a huge issue. We don't quite know what the sort of commensurate number is globally. Some regions have a good sense of this. Other regions don't have a good sense of it. And I don't think we globally quite know how big of an issue this is. This is something that I think going forward is going to be an increasingly large issue, is how do we get a sense globally of how important this leakage problem is, and how do we get this number down everywhere so that gas can provide this sort of firming role for a highly renewable dependent future. And I think that's critically important. I don't think gas is an enemy of renewables. I think gas actually is a huge facilitator of high renewable fraction grids. It's really a key piece of, at least in coming decades, it's a key piece of the puzzle. And so getting this leakage question in hand, I think, is a big part of that. And I think it's a solvable problem, and I think there's a lot of smart people working on it. So it's a very exciting time.
So the last set of issues I'd like to discuss before we throw things open is where are the real research needs? Where are the real opportunities where natural gas can play this larger role that we all envision, whether it is making gas available in parts of the world where they're dependent on LNG, whether we're talking about using natural gas more broadly, whether it's making plastics or ammonia or clean cooking fuel, as well as helping to keep the lights on. And what are the real challenges and where are the real opportunities? I think that this is a great audience to define those challenges for, because there's no place like Silicon Valley for finding people who embrace difficult challenges with novel solutions. So, Maarten, there's no question that Shell's got its own research agenda, but where do you look, globally for solutions to long-standing problems? How might Silicon Valley help Shell?
Oh, well, I think there's many ways, and it starts with some of the things that could expose the natural gas growth, like methane. I want to perhaps say a few words about it, because I think it is an important topic. Where I am absolutely convinced with you that it is solvable, it's actually being solved in many places through a combination of operating practices that prevent venting and flaring, through increased standards when it comes to manufacturing the kind of kit that is used to process natural gas, to improvements in sensing technology and et cetera, in order to really detect these leaks early and detect them when they're small. We have, walking around our gas plants around the world, people with essentially using technology that is about that scans the pipelines and the various vessels and can pick up very, very small leaks, which in natural gas, of course, is tricky because you don't see it. You don't necessarily smell it. Other than an oil refinery, a leak is pretty obvious because oil or gasoline will start dripping out. In gas, you really need detection mechanisms to do it. But nowadays, we're able to pick up very, very small leaks and act on them. So it is partly about technology, but it's also very much around operating practices in the developed world, but also in the developing world, where this issue doesn't always get the same kind of prominence that we give to it. But the agenda around the technology and innovation agenda around promoting use of gas is wide. One of them, and you mentioned before, is how can we get the conversion of gas to liquids, which makes it so much easier and more user-friendly to store and to transport. How can we get that to be on the right side of the CO2 agenda, because it's quite an energy-intensive process to turn it into liquids. So you don't want to incur so much CO2 that actually the whole process becomes additive to CO2 in the world rather than the other way around. And cheap enough so that you can really do it at scale in various places. We do gas to liquids in a number of places in the world. we're now comfortable that we can do it actually with lower CO2 intensity than an oil value chain, but it's not that easy. And it requires a lot of technology and technological progress. The other element is really about gas distribution systems. In the US, you're blessed with the fact that you have a lot of your own gas production, so really it's about pipelines and relatively well understood technology to bring the gas from where it's produced to where it's needed. Many parts of apart from Russia, there is probably, and Australia, there are not any other big economies that have enough gas. And there are other places that have far too much of it, and LNG, of course, is the bridge between the dislocation of supply and demand of gas. But LNG and in general cryogenic logistics are quite clunky and quite high cost. And some of the very promising work, it's probably more engineering research than fundamental R&D, goes into how can we get the cost of distribution of liquefied natural gas, particularly the finer distribution, down, so that indeed it makes sense to bring it to the islands of Indonesia or the Caribbean or the Philippines, that you can use it for finer transportation networks, get your trucks, get your barges to run on natural gas, but not incur an enormously high cost to get there. Because one of the things that natural gas really needs to continue to prove, that although everybody understands it's more environmentally friendly than most alternatives, apart from renewables, it shouldn't be unaffordable. It should, if it becomes too expensive, then it will price itself out of the market, and coal comes back with all the impacts that would have. So finding low-cost ways to do fine distribution of LNG and natural gas is one of the key things we're looking for. And then the third thing, and I think where Silicon Valley is particularly well placed, is to think of how can the power of digital really drive energy efficiency. Because I want to just indeed reflect on, we say doubling the energy is required. And indeed, as you say, if all the 10 billion people that end up living in the world by the end of the century would use as much energy as the citizens of the United States do today, we need to increase the energy system by a factor 6. And that is truly impossible. And it will certainly be impossible to do that and decarbonize it at the same time. And the power, to use the power of digital, to really make sure we only really use the energy that is needed. That your house isn't warmed or cooled down 24 hours a day when you're actually using only 5% of it. You can use sensors and digital technology to make sure that the system understands which rooms in the house are in use at which point of the day, and really just provide comfort to people rather than whole-scale cool the house down when 80% of it isn't used all day. And there's lots of integration required of sensor technologies, of digital, and then backwards into the energy system to make sure we can really drive the energy efficiency agenda and use the power of digital in the process. And that, I think, is an agenda that should appeal to many in this area.
I would add to that, there's huge opportunities in the leakage detection area around sensors and sort of big data integration. To give a sense of the scale of the problem, there's about 1 million wells in the United States that are operating now. About half of those are dedicated gas wells. About half of those are oil wells, but most oil wells also produce some associated gas that makes its way into the gas system. So you've got 1 million wells. You've got tens of thousands of small compressor facilities, large compressor facilities, processing stations, and distribution stations. You've got 2.5 to 3 million kilometers of pipe. This is a massive, massive system. About 80 million endpoint connections. So if this is a tree, there's about 80 million leaves at the end of these branches. These are homes, businesses, meters, and other sorts of connections to the gas system. Enormous, enormous. It's really hard to imagine a comprehensive solution to the leakage detection problem without something that looks like big data and distributed sensors. So we're talking cheap sensors that you can put near the gas meter or put near every mile along a pipe or at every wellhead and sense, okay, do I see methane? If I do, report back so that somebody can come out and fix it, right? There's also a lot of atmospheric modeling, dispersion modeling, and these sorts of computational approaches needed to be able to say, if I sense some methane, is that a big issue? Is that a small issue, right? Because it's actually quite challenging to infer from a sensor reading, is this a big leak, is this a small leak? So I think there's actually huge potential for these areas of what you might call sort of data science, data integration, and sensor development, because this system is huge, at least in North America, and very complex.
Sally.
Okay, so I'll add some thoughts in the context of deep decarbonization. So natural gas is the cleaner fossil fuel, better than coal. But the reality is we need to go to zero emissions, as I said. So yes, gas is an important transition fuel, but we need to think what more can be done to start to decarbonize natural gas. And there are two major pathways, both requiring technological breakthroughs. So the first one, if you think about producing power from a natural gas-fired power plant, carbon dioxide can be captured from that facility. We can scrub the carbon dioxide out of the gas and take that gas back and pump it underground. So, and the oil and gas industry is actually ideally suited. Imagine a world where you have a gas pipeline going from the gas field, through the pipe distribution system to the final end use, and then a second pipeline going back with carbon dioxide that's been captured, aggregated, and sent back to the gas fields or back to oil fields where you could pump it underground. So there are lots of technological opportunities, because today the cost of capture is high, the amount of energy it requires is too high, and that's really the biggest problem. So we need technological improvements in that. There are also all kinds of opportunities for sensing and monitoring that carbon dioxide that's pumped back underground to make sure that it's going where we wanted to put it and it's staying underground. So that's one set of opportunities. Another opportunity goes to transportation, to the transportation sector. So today we can imagine, especially here in California, that light-duty vehicles, cars, what we drive, will become electrified. That trajectory is well on its way. And again, if we have a low-carbon electricity system, we can decarbonize the light-duty transport sector. For heavy-duty transport, it's quite a different issue. And it's not clear that electrification is going to be the optimal pathway. In many ways, hydrogen is a better alternative for heavy-duty transport. And you can make you can make hydrogen from natural gas. Actually, that's the way it's done today, and it's the cheapest thing to do. And again, you can sequester that carbon dioxide. So basically, you take methane, you reform it, and then you do a water-gas shift reaction. You get pure hydrogen, pure CO2. You sequester the CO2, and now you've got this hydrogen that you can use in a fuel cell, or you can even combust hydrogen. And again, that's an area of both fuel cells, the hydrogen distribution system. All of that needs a lot of progress in order to make it cost-effective and scalable. So those are two big opportunities for natural gas to even play a bigger role by more deeply decarbonizing than natural gas itself.
Thank you. From a personal perspective, I've spent most of my career working on earthquake research and oil and gas research, and they've come together and in an interesting way because of all the earthquakes being induced associated with unconventional oil and gas development in the United States. But like a lot of these other environmental problems, they're solvable. Once we study the earthquakes and understand their origin, we find alternative ways of operating to solve that problem the same way we solve other environmental problems. And I look at a lot of the consequences of unconventional gas development like other things that grow very fast, and Silicon Valley is very familiar with a lot of these things. And in fact, what's happened is that this resource, which 10 years ago we were talking about building LNG import terminals into the United States. We were running out of natural gas. Now we have more natural gas than we know what to do with. We see LNG becoming a mechanism by which natural gas is a global commodity like oil. And we see countries like Lithuania at this conference that Sally mentioned, which was totally dependent on Russian gas. Suddenly, by being able to import LNG, their gas prices went down by 25% overnight. And so we have now a globally distributed supply, and we, of course, have a global need for these resources. And the system's changing very fast, but the regulatory and operational environment is not often changing in a commensurate way, and things get out of balance, and we find these long-standing environmental problems either exacerbated or we find new ones, but we simply have to identify them, work on them, and they have engineering solutions just like there are solutions to all industrial processes. I'm an upstream person in the geosciences. The recovery factors are extremely low. There's a tremendous opportunity to do far, far better than we've done with these very low recovery factors that Sally mentioned. And so there's a long way to go. And this is a resource that's widely and globally distributed. And so after this very short time of 10 years, we're not at the end. We're really at the beginning, and we're still learning. And there's a long way to go, and a lot of the things that have been happening, and a lot of the optimization that we're talking about is just beginning because it's all happened just so rapidly. We've moved the needle of the global energy system in a major way in a very short period of time, and that's really kind of hard to get your head around. And there's just a lot of aftershocks, if I can use that metaphor, that we haven't dealt with yet. So. With that, I'd like to open up the discussion and engage the audience, and we'll take your questions. And please, on any of the topics we've talked about or any other topics that are on your mind, please raise your hand, and they'll bring a microphone to you.
Hi, is this working? Yeah. So I'm Brooke Porter from Kleiner Perkins. We're investors in this space. About 10 years ago, we started investing in energy, and as we looked at the landscape of technologies and how they could be impactful in energy, we considered natural gas as being part of that mix. It wasn't clear completely that it was absolutely necessary, but it looked highly likely, and certainly as the lowest carbon hydrocarbon, it looked like an area that we should have some focus. We came to a couple of conclusions I just wanted to share with you and get your views on them. On the supply side, we thought about decarbonizing natural gas, and we really focused on biogas, and you didn't mention that one, so I was curious what your views are on the potential for biogas. Obviously, in the current pricing environment, it's a little challenging, but we invested in a company called Harvest Power that collects organic waste. It's a way to optimize our waste streams and produce natural gas that way. On the demand side, one thing that we observed is that the majority of natural gas used in energy is burned. It's burned for mainly electricity generation. And a broad thesis we have is that we really shouldn't be burning things anymore. It's a 20th, 18th, 10,000-year-old technology, right, or 10 million, I don't know, when fire was invented. And we can do better than that. And so we think about either producing electricity without combustion, so solid oxide fuel cells is one approach, and we think about making chemicals from it directly, make something useful, make a material out of it. If it's a plastic or a material that's not being burned, then it's not necessarily sequestered underground, but it's certainly delaying the release of CO2. So on the generation side, we invested in Bloom Energy, distributed, highly efficient, a much better fit in our mind with the way that renewable energy is being deployed on a distributed basis. And on the conversion side, we invested in Siluria, and Rahul, I'm sure, will have some comments on this, but the idea of directly converting natural gas into chemicals is a pretty powerful thing that the industry tried for a long time and was unable to successfully commercialize. We think we've done it. So those are a couple of thoughts there that you didn't touch on. I'd just love to hear your feedback.
You raised a lot of issues. Who'd like to address some of them?
Yeah, maybe I'll say a little bit about the fuel cells. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to make further improvements. I mean, it's good that we've got Bloom. But it would be nice to find new catalysts that allow us to directly reduce the methane or oxidize the methane, as opposed to having to go through the step of reforming the methane before. So you have to use a certain fraction of the energy for another purpose. So it would be, I think there's a lot of room in improving fuel cells. There's actually some really exciting. I don't know if you followed ExxonMobil's announcement that they've invested in a direct carbonate fuel cell, or a carbonate fuel cell, which will allow you to basically capture carbon dioxide, and at the same time, instead of having the capture be parasitic on the generation, that you actually produce more power, and in the process you can produce a pure stream of CO2 that you can sequester. So I think that's another really novel application where you get sort of two bangs for the buck, more power and CO2 capture. So yeah, I think that that whole area is ripe for new ideas and
Maarten?
Yeah, so biofuels and biogas is absolutely a major component of the decarbonized system that we see evolve in the course of the century. Could have as much as 15% of that double global energy mix that we're talking about. The mixture of fuels and gas. The key thing there is to move from what is currently predominantly first generation biofuels, where there's a number of successful applications. We have a big business in Brazil that does sugarcane to biofuel relatively successfully, but it's hard to scale up to become meaningful in the energy system without getting into competition with food and with other things the planet needs. So you're really then into second and third generation biofuels and biogas, where indeed all kinds of non-edible wastes can be used in order to produce these, to eventually produce biofuels and biogas. And it's not only important because obviously being bio, it will have absorbed CO2 in order to become what it is. It is also the only really promising area where you could go into, apart from capturing and sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is tough to do economically. It's the only area where you could really get into net negative emissions. Where if you have a biofuel or biogas value chain, and then you capture the CO2 it produces and store it, then you're into net negative emissions. And that decarbonized system that we want to have at the end will still use hydrocarbons. There are applications of hydrocarbons that you simply can't get away from. You can't fly a plane on a battery. You can't make cement or steel without having hydrocarbons. And there's just a number of applications. And so there will be CO2 emissions that are hard or uneconomic to capture. So you need a very substantial bio part of that energy mix, and then capture the CO2 it produces to become net zero. And we believe that can be done. But it's also limited in total. So with more than 50% bio will be difficult in terms of the amount of waste that is around that you can usefully use, which is another reason why you can't go beyond doubling the energy system, because the amount of bio will otherwise shrink too much relatively in the system. And then you can't get to net zero anymore. So bio, very, very interesting to hear your story, and we're a big believer in biofuels as a major part of the future energy system and a big investor in it.
Adam?
First disagreement. I don't think biogas is worth a penny of your money, to be totally honest. It's really, there's fundamental problems with, biogas and biofuels may have limited applications, especially if we need some portion of net negative emissions in the later part of the century. I can see that. The fundamental problem is that humanity has nearly completely decoupled itself from natural energy flows and the magnitude of natural energy flows. Wes Herman, as part of a GCEP effort about 10 years ago, did the first fundamental mapping of sort of global, what's called exergy, or global energy flows around the planet. As it turns out, what's called net primary productivity, so the fundamental productivity, the fundamental capture of solar energy by all plants, oceans, algae, trees, grasses, everything, is about 90 terawatts, okay? And that's a unit of 90 trillion watts continuously averaged over the course of a year. Humans consume, we're at probably close to 20 terawatts as we speak. Humans consume an enormous fraction, our energy consumption is an enormous fraction of the total productivity. That 90 terawatts fuels every biological thing on the planet. That fuels our muscles, our activity. When you go on a jog, you're using some of this primary productivity. So there just is the scale of availability of biomass is just not there. It may be a niche solution. It is, and it has its virtues, but those virtues I think are small, and I think it's going to be pretty limited. I think we are living in a future where humans are using even more energy, in comparison to what natural systems can provide. Another really important example of this is fertilizer. People don't realize this, but a large part of the last century's green revolution, the reason that there's 7 billion people on this planet, is because of the advent of artificial nitrogen fertilizers. Plants are fundamentally nitrogen limited. It's the limiting macronutrient in most global ecosystems is nitrogen. Humans produce far more fixed nitrogen than natural ecosystems ever did. And it's been estimated that something like 70% of the nitrogen molecules that are in your body, in your muscles, in your DNA, and everything are produced from artificially fixed nitrogen, basically from natural gas. That is, if we did not have artificial nitrogen, something like 70% of people would basically not be alive. Okay? And so we have to, biomass has a really fuzzy sort of feeling about it, or it gives people nice feelings. It just does not work to provide the amounts of energy that humans need. And I think from a fundamental physics perspective, it's just not going to be the solution. And
Yeah.
I mean, Sal, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so Chris Field, who works at the Carnegie Institute, did a study for us at the Global Climate and Energy Project looking at the potential of biomass, particularly looking at use of marginal lands, so not cutting down new forests, but taking marginal lands, not using agricultural lands, and concluded that about 15% of the global energy demand could be met with bio. So on one hand, you can say that's a giant number, and on the other hand, you can say, well, it's not a very big number. I just want to give an anecdote about the use of biogas, though. This would be landfill-generated gases. So I had a student who we were working on deep decarbonization of industry in emerging economies, and we looked at the steel industry, in particular in Brazil, and said, well, is there any way we could decarbonize the steel industry in Brazil? And it turned out that biogas, waste landfill gas, looked like an interesting opportunity, and there are now new technologies to produce steel without coal, using simply natural gas. It's a better, more efficient process. And it turns out there's enough landfill gas in Brazil to fuel the entire steel-making industry, which is one of the largest in the world. So whereas it's maybe not a big part of the solution for things where you don't have other alternatives for decarbonizing, like steelmaking, I think those are really interesting opportunities.
And so 15% is indeed also the kind of ceiling that we use.
Oh, okay. So 1.5. Okay, right.
1.5. I didn't say 15. No, it's
right.
1.5 would be the ceiling we use. But it's not a nice to have in the system if
Right.
you really want to decarbonize.
Yeah.
You have to have it because it's the only thing that you can push into net negative
Right.
that we can see at the moment.
Yeah.
None of this is the solution.
Well,
You need a lot of solutions.
Well, I wanted to add one point. In terms of an intermediate research goal, and Sally others alluded to, anything that can generate a pure stream of CO2 has the potential for beneficial use, and greatly reduces the sequestration problem because when you actually consider flue gas, a very small part of that is in fact CO2. So that's one thing that is sort of an immediate goal. And another, which is a longer term and a more difficult goal, is to do something beneficial with that carbon that's in the CO2, and that's to put the CO2 into a solid, the carbon into a solid form, whether it's carbon fibers or whatever. And it solves both the sequestration problem. It's a much more stable thing to do, and it's providing what can be something put to good use. And that's a more difficult issue, but would certainly be a welcome one. Other questions, other issues?
Hi, my name is Nina. I'm with Parker Hannafin, the Veriflow Division up in Richmond. Totally not new thing. We've started in the natural gas vehicle industry, I guess within the last 5 years within my division in Parker. But I know that's been around for a long time. I heard you say using natural gas to help hydrogen be the fuel for a heavy truck, and I've heard you say that transportation, the heavy-duty transportation market could maybe use more natural gas. So just hoping to get more insight on what your thoughts were about that. And outside of just heavy-duty truck, also stationary engines and rail possibly as well, just if you had any views on where natural gas can play there.
Okay. Natural gas is a direct fuel for transportation? Martin?
Yep. It's as you say, it's happening, and it's actually quite a healthy growth market where we see increasingly ship owners switching to using LNG as a fuel for their ships rather than heavy fuel oil or marine gas oil. Gas is cheaper than most of the other liquids, and it's clearly cleaner. One interesting anecdote: we're seeing a lot of cruise ship companies starting to get into energy fired ships. A 6,000 people cruise liner use the amount of power of a village of 30,000 people. So these are big power users. From a corporate social responsibility perspective, but also visibility, a cruise ship leaving the harbor with this big black smoke behind it is never good for the advert. So we see a big uptake in the use of LNG for heavy transport ships, and indeed trucks, and in some cases buses. Although buses tend to use more compressed natural gas than liquefied natural gas because they don't need the range. And that's an exciting development because clearly from an air quality perspective that helps a lot, and there is a CO2 benefit, although it's in the low teens rather than the coal to gas, it will be a lot more. I think if you think further forward though, that gas used by ships and trucks will be burned, in the engines of the ship, and the CO2 that's released there is really difficult to do anything with. So although it's more friendly than the current solutions, that will still be a CO2 producing journey. The way around that will be if in a centralized location use the natural gas to produce hydrogen, you can capture the CO2 and do something useful with it, or put it into the ground, and then use the hydrogen to use in fuel cells and ships and trucks to actually truly have a zero carbon value chain. I think these things are not necessarily things that work against each other. The hydrogen solution will take a lot of time from an infrastructure perspective and from a technology perspective to become scalable. In the meantime, moving to natural gas instead of fuel oil and gas oil has CO2, but also very importantly air quality benefits. So I think that's probably a sequential thing. And even in the long term, there will be transport solutions that just need the energy density of the energy solution, so they will live next to each other. But that's how I see the long term play out. Don't know what Sally, what do you?
Yeah,
whether you agree with that?
maybe to say I agree with that. No, I think that sequence of events is right. I mean, one of the challenges that we have with regard to use of natural gas in heavy duty transportation is that today the engines and trucks that can do that are more expensive than a gas or a diesel powered engine. And when oil was $100 a barrel, natural gas, I don't know if you remember, there was the whole natural gas highway, and there were things popping up all over the country, and that was very exciting. It has non-CO2 emissions benefits that make it attractive, particularly for things like ports. But as long as there's not a significant difference in the cost per BTU of fuel, I think it's going to be hard to really jumpstart the natural gas trucking industry, unless, for example, it's just driven by policy, which is focused on other pollutants that are associated with the use of diesel in heavily congested areas.
Yeah, the science on the greenhouse gas benefits of gas use in transport, as Maarten said, the benefits are pretty marginal. I think that to a large extent over the coming decades, the climate challenge is really we got to get rid of coal. It's a filthy fuel in so many ways and really impacts a lot of people's quality of life, especially in Asia. And so I think that's the low-hanging fruit. In transport, we will see some benefits, especially if leakage can be held to a low value, but it's not a huge win over diesel.
Next question.
Yes. Hello. Is this on?
Close to your mouth.
Good morning. I'm Ed Beardsworth, Energy Technology Advisors, local. Closer? A couple of thoughts on leaks. Your colleague Dan Reichert is famous for citing the triad of technology, policy, and money as necessary to accomplish anything. I had an experience a number of years ago working with a startup that had a remarkable natural gas leak detection system, airborne. And when I tried to go to gas utilities to tell them about this, they were specifically disinterested. They did not want to find leaks. They said, I can't dispatch a truck every time there's a bug fart somewhere. Yeah. And so it came down to their incentives, their budgets, their O&M arrangements, where they couldn't afford to go and chase every leak that could be found. So they didn't want to find them in the first place. It was an interesting illustration of the complexity of some of these things.
It's a very sobering reality that you're talking about. Looking at the after effects of the Aliso Canyon disaster in Southern California, there are 400 or so, close to 400 gas storage plants around the United States, and yet the move to be proactive and try to find potential problems in these other sites it is almost non-existent, and the attitude of the utilities is they'll do what they need to do when they're told to do it, and it's really disheartening. Being proactive would be.
I also wanted to go into the question of landfill gas and wastewater treatment and the role for anaerobic digestion and so on. If you don't do those things, it's going to escape as methane. So the idea of dismissing any kind of a biogas initiative is an important part of this. It's going to be an emission of methane rather than something else into the emission. The final question I wanted to ask, and then I'll stop, is comparing all of these leaks and emissions to what happens thanks to Mother Nature. Mother Nature emits a lot of methane out of soils and rotting materials and clathrates and all sorts of other things. So how does what we're doing compare to what would be there naturally, and is it on scale?
So that's a good question. Yeah. So back to biogas. Okay, I'll step back. I didn't need to be so harsh. It's fine. We need to do it. California captures most of its landfill gas. Everywhere needs to do that. We can use it. It's not going to solve the problem in general, but it will make a contribution, particularly where we need carbon in an industrial process, for example. With regard to leaks, I've heard much the same that you've heard. Sally's students work with high-pressure gas in the lab. The thing, and I talk to these students, and they're pulling their hair out. And the thing about high-pressure gas, nature abhors a vacuum. Nature abhors a pressure differential. 24/7, 365 days a year, every second that gas wants to escape. It's relentless. Okay, so leaks will be there. This is very problematic from a regulatory point of view. EPA has a new regulation. Essentially, as we read it, the regulation suggests you will use an infrared camera. They're amazing. We have one. Super fun. You can see the leaks. If you find it, you fix it. The companies are terrified of this. Good policy in theory, sounds great. You're going to find a lot of stuff. The vast majority of those leaks are not economic to fix. What we find is that there's the distribution of the size of gas leaks is extremely what's called heavy-tailed. A large fraction of the emissions come from a very small number of the sources. We have something we call the 550 rule. If you fix the largest 5% of leaks, you're going to solve 50% of the problem. If you fix the largest 10% of leaks, you're going to solve 80 to 90% of the problem. So really, the push should not be if you find it, you fix it. This incentivizes people to not look very hard. Because I don't want to find this because I'm going to spend thousands of dollars fixing something that's leaking a tiny amount of gas. It really should be you find it, you get smart, you say, that's the big one. Let's fix it as fast as possible. Yeah, there's going to be small leaks everywhere. It's inevitable. Ask PG&E. Ask anyone. They're there. But you got to find the big ones. You got to find them fast. You got to fix them. No tolerance for big leaks. And let's be smart about where we put our money because we don't have infinite money. Kleiner, you guys may know this. These commodity energy industries, brutally competitive. No mercy. No mercy. Extremely tight margins on everything. These are hard businesses to make money in. You tell these guys, now you need to send people around and fix every tiny little thing. I've been in meetings with these folks. It gives everyone complete indigestion because they're trying to stay afloat as it is with $2 gas. So this is a real problem, and I think maybe a bigger challenge in reality than technology or any of this big data stuff we were talking about earlier, is the policy incentives. I don't really work on them, but it's a huge challenge.
I agree. I think policy plays a big role there. Actually, we have infrared cameras at all our gas facilities, and they're great. They're unbelievable.
Yeah, they're really cool.
There is the gas price in the U.S., of course, particularly low.
Yeah.
There are other parts in the world where people actually make a business out of this, where they go to plants and say, we will detect your leaks and fix them, and you will give us the equivalent of the value of the gas that is now still in your system over a period of time, and you will pay that out to us. And that's a business model. We have people offering that to us. I don't know whether it's been offered to us in the States. With the gas price, it may be problematic. But in place where gas prices are higher, people actually make a business model about using their own detection mechanisms to go and fix leaks and then keep the difference, keep the value of the gas they saved. But I do think there is a regulatory intervention required in this area, because it is obviously not acceptable for people not to want to find their leaks. That is not a world we can live in.
Yeah, a footnote on this new EPA regulation is that they're required by Congress to estimate the cost, and their estimated cost to industry in the United States was $250 million over a 5-year period. And at a recent meeting, one company came, kind of a mid-sized independent producer, said the cost they estimated was $250 million for their company alone. And so while it's well-intentioned, it's misconstrued, and it provides a burden without the desired benefit. When 1% of, 5% of 1% are causing 50% of the leaks, 1 in 2,000 leaks, you really have to create a system that looks for them and addresses that problem as quickly as possible.
Yeah, sorry, let me clarify what Mark just said. That's important. In surveys where they've gone out to gas facilities, about 1% of components or valves or things like this are found to be leaking on average. It's 0.5%, maybe it's 1.5%. Just think about 1 in 100 components has a problem. Of those, the top 5% of all leaks, so 5% of 1% is 1 in 2,000 is really the problem. You find those 1 in 2,000, fix them very quickly. No leniency on those ones. Fix them quickly. Hugely NPV positive. Huge profitability to fix the big ones, and that's a vast majority of the problem. And so really focusing our efforts on the big ones is where very smart.
Just to add a little more to that, so there's a technology, a cavity ring down spectrometer, Picaro, company in the Valley developed that, and it turns out that it can detect very minute amounts of methane. And Rob Jackson, a professor at Stanford University, took that instrument, put it in a car, and literally drove the streets of Boston and then Washington, D.C., and found an enormous amount of leaks in the gas distribution system, which is entirely different than the upstream production facilities. And the reality is it's not very expensive to buy one of those, and pesky academics or other motivated people are going to be driving the streets, finding these things. And so already we're at Stanford seeing an alignment between the utility companies and this kind of research to join together to not do this as a gotcha, but let's go out and do this together. Let's really develop the methodology. So I think the combination of cool technology and creative individuals have figured out a way that will focus more attention. And I'm more optimistic that the companies will want to address these problems.
And I'm optimistic that the policy in the future will be based more on science than simply a sense of what needs to be done, because it wasn't based on good science. Next question.
Can I ask you to comment on the natural emissions?
So compared to pre-industrial levels, ambient levels of methane are quite a bit higher. They've gone up by 500 ppb or half a ppm. Industrial emissions do contribute. My understanding is the global methane budget is reasonably poorly understood. And so where all these fluxes are coming from is still, in many ways, I've heard it said there was an editorial in Science, where is the extra methane coming from? Methane has started to go up again in the atmosphere after about a 10-year plateau, not well understood. Lots of combinations of extremely complex natural fluxes, agriculture, rice paddies, animal farming. It's a very complex subject.
Well, and then concerns about the melting of the tundra areas where permafrost, where you have methane clathrates present that can start to release. So that is a really big concern. If warming continues and goes to high levels, we could really have a very large natural methane release. Yeah. And so keeping as low as we can is a real motivated by that.
Yeah, hi. Dan Miller from the Rotor Group. I want to challenge the premise of some of the discussions here today. So natural gas generates about half the CO2 compared to coal inside a turbine. But overall, as we're talking about fugitive emissions, there's really, it's not that. And also it's 30 times more over 100 years, but over 20 years it's more like 100 times more powerful. So over 20 years, good chance that natural gas is as bad as coal when it comes to global warming, not human health and air particulates and things. So if it is, and we have this 2-degree limit from COP21 and a 1.5-degree limit, which is an aspirational goal, well, the first 3 months of this year was 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. We have the lowest Arctic ice ever. We have recent scientific papers saying we're going to see multi-meter sea level rise this century. So things are really kind of going off the rails from the climate point of view. So my understanding is that we're supposed to be down at zero emissions by 2050, and you can't reduce emissions by increasing them. So if we're continuing to pump out more fossil fuels, including natural gas, which again on a climate basis, maybe you'd agree, is 25% less bad than coal. When you overall, if it is 1.5% instead of 3% or something like that. So given that, how do we have to go to zero in a few decades from now, and everything we learn is worse than we thought the year before. Yeah. How do we really deal with this if we have to actually go to zero?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we all have a response to that, because you're raising a lot of really important issues. The fact of the matter is that coal is the fastest growing source of energy in the world. And so, using a far cleaner fuel, both with respect to greenhouse gas and air pollution, is quite beneficial. That wasn't an option, not that long ago, but it is an option now. Removing the methane leaks from the system as it expands, but also finding the leaks that have been in the system for a long time. These leaks that Sally referred to in Washington and Boston, this has nothing to do with the modern era of unconventional gas. We're talking about 100-year-old pipelines, iron pipes in metropolitan areas that are leaking gas to the atmosphere. These are findable, fixable, and everybody benefits. So the attention paid to this problem, because of the concerns you raised, will fix longstanding problems that are irrespective of any expanded use of natural gas. And I guess the third thing I'll say, and let the others contribute, is this critical period where we need a lot of energy, we need clean energy fast. This, what we refer to as the transition in electrical power and maybe small and light duty vehicles and the parts where natural gas can make a contribution. It will make a contribution. And it's easy. What's happened in the United States can happen elsewhere in the world with this fuel switching. It was easy because the electrical grids are there. They're often peaking plants at coal-burning power plants that are only used rarely in the summer, so there's a gas pipeline there, and taking out that old, polluting that coal plant, which was completely amortized anyway, and had, and replacing it. It's really low-hanging fruit. Now, addressing the broader issue and how we do this transition and what role gas is going to play over a longer period of time is a really important question for all the reasons that you raised.
What I challenge you said is clean air, which I agree. Particulate matters, no less mercury and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, let's put that aside and just look at the climate challenge, because if we don't solve the climate challenge, the particulate problem is not going to be a big problem for us. But you said it's also much better from a climate point of view, but I'm saying it's not. It's as bad as coal over a 20-year period, maybe, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, and maybe at best 25% less bad. So that's not really much better, especially when you have to go to zero.
Yeah. So a couple things. So over a 100-year time period, the sort of trade-off between coal and gas, according to a paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, is in the 7% leakage sort of range over a 100-year period. Over a 20-year period is in the 3% range. A couple things to note. One is that gas power plants almost always draw directly from a large diameter either transmission sort of pipe or a large diameter distribution main, which knocks out at least 0.5% of distribution emissions. And so the effective emissions associated with a large gas plant are lower than gas you use in your house because it doesn't go through this leaky infrastructure. I think a target of 1%, which there's an industry collaborative called One Future, which is a bunch of gas producing companies aiming for 1%. I think that's doable. And in that case, there's clear benefits. Coal is filthy. Coal is absolutely filthy and needs to be removed from the human equation. It's really a nasty fuel. It's the fuel of the past. I think the challenge in Asia, they think it's not like people in China don't know this. Why are they not using gas? Gas is seen as historically, and I think this is what Mark is talking about. Expensive, subject to geopolitical upset. China doesn't want to be beholden to Putin and all these things. Maybe with an expanding gas sector, the idea that coal is the reliable fuel for Asia, for the billions in Asia, maybe that goes away and maybe it becomes gas. And I really think if we do it well, there's large benefit both for people and for the climate in the near term. In the long term, you're totally right. And I even think in the medium term, gas and renewables are not enemies. I think we need to push renewables as hard as possible because we don't just need to change out the system we have, we need to double it. That increase in energy use is going to happen. Doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what you think. There's 7 billion people on the planet. They want more energy. I'm not going to tell them to use less energy because I have a nice life using a lot of energy, although I try to be efficient. I can't tell someone in China not to use energy, so it's going to happen regardless. No one gives a damn what I think. Okay? So it's going to happen. So how do we make it happen? I think we make it happen by making natural gas a clean source. And so the idea that you have to use coal in India, in China, where they're still building huge numbers of plants, can go away. And I think that's an immediate low-hanging fruit. I think it'll have huge benefits for the climate if we do the gas system right.
Yeah, it's all these numbers have ranges, but it's important. First of all, if you compare purely the power plant comparison between coal and gas, it's even better than 50%. It's kind of 40% of the CO2 intensity of coal. Whether you use the two most efficient ones or the average fleet in the US, you get to about 40 instead of 50. The reason it goes to 50 is indeed the methane difference. But we shouldn't forget coal, particularly deep mined coal, emits quite a bit of methane as well. On a 100-year basis, the 50% is absolutely robust. On a 20-year basis, you get somewhere halfway, and that's a philosophical debate that you and I won't agree on. But the 50% on a 100-year basis, which most of the global science uses when it looks at climate change, the 50% is robust. The important part, indeed, as you say, is to displace coal as soon as possible, because if we wait and design the next generation solution and continue to emit as we are for the next 10 years, it's all about cumulative greenhouse gases. So moving fast is important. And one of the concerns I have, as you say, 2050 net zero energy would be consistent with 1.5 degree temperature rise. End of the century is consistent with about 2% energy, 2 degree energy, and we can debate between 2 and 1.5. We can debate how fast gas needs to go out of the power system, but at the moment we're not even going to 2 degrees. We're overshooting in a big way. I see Paris in a sense as the moment when all the governments took a subscription to the gym, but they're still wondering. They're still not quite.
That's a great analogy. Still got a kid on the bike and ride.
Whether they're going to use it is still to be seen, and in some places more than others. The coal to gas to me is a no-brainer, but it clearly isn't enough. We need to work very hard on storage solutions, so eventually, your solar can cover 24 hours a day in California, rather than needing lots of fossil fuel backup over time. But the science is that isn't ready yet. So at the moment, rather than waiting for the perfect end system, we need to act. We need to move, and at the same time, and that's one of the things, is continue to really work hard on bio, on hydrogen, on storage solution, etc. And I think the role that policy has to play in this is one of the things that we probably haven't discussed much today. But I do believe that where governments, particularly the German government perhaps, but also the US government, have been quite instrumental in driving down the cost of solar and wind by feed-in tariffs, etc. And lots of, in Germany, more than $100 billion has been spent on this. In Japan, very major amounts. The amount of money that goes into thinking through hydrogen solutions or building infrastructure to make hydrogen work, into CCS subsidies to make carbon capture, is tiny. And because somehow it isn't something that the politicians believe the public wants. But the public needs it. And so there's a big policy agenda that I think is, that at the moment, I think we haven't expressed much today. And certainly doesn't get the traction it needs to even get close to zero emissions zero carbon by the end of the century, let alone halfway.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Doug Kirkpatrick, I'm the CEO of Blackpack. We're a small East-based startup commercializing a next-generation technology for co-fueling vehicles using both natural gas and liquid fuel. We use a nanoporous carbon to actually store the natural gas at much lower pressure and therefore a much lower pressure compressor, which allows us to make the system dramatically more affordable. I loved your gym membership analogy.
I'm going to steal that from you.
Yeah, because
I think we all are.
Yeah, I was going to use the analogy being a parent and getting my kids to invest in their 401k. That little investments now make a big difference later, and we don't want to be thinking, oh, we'll just make the investment 20 years from now when I'm rich. You want to take the $1,000 now and get it into the investment account. So small changes now are equivalent to much, much larger changes that may be required later. So I think we need to have our mindset much more around how do we aggregate large numbers of little changes as quickly as we can. I understand that most of the panelists are associated with Stanford University, but I would, as also a venture investor alongside Brooke, I would turn around and say we do need to be thinking about what I would call the near long term as opposed to the long term, because that comes back to where your investments in your 401k are going to come from. As Brooke knows, I was also the chief scientist at DARPA when the DoD actually delivered the first drop-in aviation biofuels. Those are a reality today. And I think there are pieces of the market that we have to recognize are never going to go away from a liquid fuel environment, but that doesn't mean they can't be carbon neutral or carbon negative. Eni uses that technology today. When they refuel airplanes in Italy today, they are 50% biojet fuel today. When we talk about leaks, and there's a lot of technologies, as you're all aware of things coming out, I think we need to be careful that we have fugitive leaks, but we also have purposeful leaks. We have people who are venting, and we need to make sure that all of these drivers, as Maarten was pointing out, as you were pointing out, they're economically driven to solve those leaks. And there are technological opportunities to provide, in the near term, to provide the economic drivers to take these small vent systems. They're allowed to vent relatively small amounts today, and we can turn those into economic benefit. Again, I realize it's putting grains of rice in a pot, but this is the path we need to take now. Lastly, as one of the Silicon Valley innovators, I'm truly amused by the EPA. If I wasn't frustrated, I have to be amused. We recently went through the process where we reviewed all of their regulations, and there are no regulations forbidding what we're doing. And when we approached them, they said, right, there's no regulations forbidding what you're doing, but there's no regulations allowing what you're doing, so therefore it's not allowed. Now, mind you, what we're doing wasn't contemplated 5 years ago when they wrote the regulations. So at a regulatory and policy environment, if we really are going to be innovators solving the problems, that's a bigger problem. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of those points.
Yeah. Adam.
So occasionally professors have ideas. I've got my own leak detection idea. I write it down, write proposals on it, start a student working on it. I discovered that somebody in Exxon 5 years ago pre-invented my idea. This often happens. You read the papers. Oh, somebody else has my idea. This Exxon IP is actually being licensed by a small engineering firm in back east. They're called Providence Engineering. What does this technology do? It takes a standard issue infrared camera, applies an iPad. You literally strap an iPad to it, some computational algorithms, and estimates how big the leak is. So you're not just viewing the leak. You're saying how big it is. This was my idea as well, applying algorithms to figure out, is this a big leak? Is this a small leak? He can't sell the thing. Why can't he sell the thing? He can't sell the thing because the EPA reg says, you find it, you fix it. It doesn't say, you find it, you determine if it's worth fixing, then you fix it. So what he's offering is an ability for companies to, that's a big one, fix it. That's a big one, fix it. Those ones, ignore it. There's no value in that because the regulation does not give them that latitude. Which is frankly, I mean, I hate to say bad things about the EPA because philosophically I'm completely in alignment with them. I work 18 hours a day on the environment. That's all I think about. But it's really hit with a hammer as hard as we can, rather than being wise about it. So there is a technology that will allow you to triage and fix the big emitters and really be profitable in your leak detection effort. And he can't sell them because there's no value to the companies because EPA will say, you saw that and you didn't fix it. Well, I didn't fix it because it would save me $5 of gas over the next 10 years. Right? And have negligible environmental benefit. That's why I didn't fix it. So we need to be smart about this, and I'm not in charge, so I don't know what I can say.
I think that we need to move to a more collaborative approach to work with the EPA to develop regulations that make sense. I think that they're in a very tough position. They get it from all sides.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so I think they're in a tough position. But fundamentally, we could move past the sort of adversarial situation that I think we've really been in for 20 or 30 years with regarding energy, climate, environment. If we could all work together to solve these problems, then I think the EPA would be in a position to do a better job to make science-based regulation.
It's what you get if the industry hangs back, waiting to be caught out, rather than proactively engages on the issue and proactively co-creates a solution. Yeah. I think, yes, the EPA in this case, and I don't know the regulation by heart, but the way you describe it, it sounds pretty unfortunate. But my guess is the industry as a total wasn't proactively coming up with ways to do this, and then it got hit by something it didn't want. Yeah. And that is not a way forward that we can live with. I think there's a real, at the end of the day, to blame the regulator means that you were too late.
Yeah, that's
right. You weren't influential enough, and you didn't actually propose something that would work for you, or even implement it before the regulator even did anything. And that to me is a model where an industry is much more proactive about deciding to do the right thing, on a risk basis, rather than on a bureaucratic basis. Is the way forward. There are certainly green shoots on that, but the industry has a lot to think about here, I think.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to throw any rocks at the EPA. They as Sally said, they have to hide under their desk because they get rocks thrown at them from all sides. So I didn't mean to contribute to that. I'm just a little frustrated that it seems like a smarter way to do it is effectively disallowed by the way the regulation is written.
I'm with you, frustrated about my own industry.
Yeah,
that isn't proactive enough to shape its own destiny and then complains about the regulation that's just hit it. We need to do better than that.
And if I can interject a word from one of our sponsors, that's one of the goals of the Natural Gas Initiative, to be a convening authority to discuss some of these issues from the perspective of an academic institution, as opposed, when a company says something, it's viewed with suspicion right from the get-go, and you're kind of swimming upstream, no matter how logical and sensible the argument is, and it's understandable why that is. But if we can find the opportunity for identifying these issues early on and engaging in this broader discussion that leads to more sensible policies, I think we will all be beneficial, and we can look at these opportunities as a contribution we can make, as well as the fundamental research that's being done in a number of these different areas. Addressing policy and regulatory issues is one of the goals of the Natural Gas Initiative, and we hope not to be too late to the dance the next time an issue like this is being considered by the EPA. I'd like to thank our panel for a lot of useful discussions. There are a lot of things we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I hope our comments have been useful and helpful. I think we'll all be here for a few minutes as we end the session, and we can follow up individually on different topics. So if the audience would please join me in thanking our panel, and we thank all of you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you sharing your views so candidly with us. Thank you for your great questions. As a very small token of our appreciation, we have for you today the Churchill Club Speaker T-shirt. Please wear that in
Free
good
T-shirts,
health.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Our next program is on the 21st at the Rosewood Sandhill. It is about category design, the emerging discipline of defining and hopefully dominating markets over time. Hope you can join us for that. You have been a wonderful audience. By the way, a recording of this should be on our YouTube channel early next week, so please share it with others if you believe that this conversation would be useful to them. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.